What do Peter Thiel, Shania Twain, James Cameron and Flea from the Red Hot Chili Peppers all have in common? Well, quite a few things, I suspect, but one is that they've all bought prime New Zealand land. They're not alone, of course, just more well known than many of the foreigners who've spent large sums buying New Zealand real estate. But in general terms, that's about to change. Now, Peter Thiel is a citizen, of course, controversially, but the government has moved to make it harder for wealthy offshore buyers who aren't also New Zealanders to purchase New Zealand farmland. It will soon require the Overseas Investment Office to apply stringent sensitive land criteria to most of the farms that will come up for sale. Ministers say it's to give New Zealanders a better chance of securing rural land, but it will also help avoid the anti-foreigner backlash that's been seen in the US, the UK and, of course, in Europe. Here's our political editor, Jane Patterson.
At the moment, the office has to apply the more stringent rules only to very large farms, about 10 times the size of an average holding. That will change from the 15th of December to cover any farm 5 hectares or larger. The Associate Finance Minister David Parker says New Zealanders should be given the best opportunity to buy land.
We believe it's a privilege to own New Zealand land and that we shouldn't just be selling it willy-nilly to overseas buyers. The current directive to the Overseas Investment Act about how they balance the competing criteria that are set out under the Overseas Investment Act regulations is very, very permissive.
The Land Information Minister Eugenie Sage says there should be greater protection for land, which is of high value to New Zealand as it relies so heavily on primary production. In 2010, the national government required the office to apply sensitive land criteria to large areas of farmland in terms of the potential benefit to New Zealand. Ms Sage says that is too weak.
And it undermines the criteria in the Overseas Investment Act. So what this new directive does is put a greater emphasis on the criteria for increased export receipts, more processing and a really substantial benefit to New Zealand when overseas persons go to buy land. The large farm directive meant that the Act was only really applying to sheep and beef farms that were over 7,000 hectares and dairy farms that were nearly 2,000 hectares in size.
David Parker says the government wants to avoid the backlash reflected by the election of President Trump, Brexit and the rise of some fringe parties in Europe.
I think that the middle class in New Zealand is uncomfortable that their prospects in life are being, to a certain extent, hampered by the influence of 1%ers from overseas who can outbid them for assets that they would otherwise be the buyer of.
Nationals finance spokesperson Stephen Joyce says he's seen no sign of that.
I don't actually detect that. I spend a lot of time in regional New Zealand. They're very practical people. They generally know that farmland doesn't leave the country when it changes hands.
And he rejects any suggestion it was open slather for foreign sales under National.
Well, actually, I think you'll find the previous government actually saw less of that happening than the government before that. Look, at the end of the day, it's all about investment and positive investment in regional New Zealand that adds value and adds jobs. We want to see that encouraged, and that's why we'll have a watching brief on this.
Federated Farmers Vice President Andrew Hoggard says this is a good move and won't have a big impact on New Zealand farmers.
If there is going to be investment, then there should be a clear, unambiguous benefit to New Zealand, not just a case of doing what other farmers are doing, but able to pay a higher price for the land or a few little trinket type additions to the farm. There's been a number of examples where our members have sort of raised issues with some of the purchases.
Fish and Game is also pleased with the new directive. Its chief executive Martin Taylor says access to land as a result of foreign sales has noticeably eroded over the past decade.
Well, when a large farm or station is sold, the access rights that Kiwis may have enjoyed get stopped, or the new owners say, hey, I don't want to allow the Kiwis access to this river or lake. I want that to be for me and my family, or I'm going to sell it to people who come and pay for it. So what we do is we lose access rights to those places which really Kiwis should have access to.
The new directive will apply to any application still being assessed by the office as of the 15th and any lodged from then on. The Land Information Minister Eugenie Sage says it may well mean some applications that would have been approved under the old directive could now be rejected. From Parliament for Checkpoint, Jane Patterson.